everyone, it's Lynn from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to video 2 for the Coleus bowler bag. We're going to be starting the exterior assembly of our bag in this video. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark the strap connector placements on our main body exterior panels. So you're going to need your main body pattern piece, and then I just use my hole punch and I punch out the strap connector placement holes. Then I will place the pattern piece on one half of the main body exterior piece, and then I just use, this is like a white fabric pencil, and I just mark the location of those two dots. And what those two dots are guides for is the very top edge of your strap connector. Then I flip this over, just make sure I can see those. So I flip these over and then I transfer the marks to the other half. Now, if you're using a fabric marker or fabric pen, just make sure that it does eventually disappear. It's either erasable or it disappears. Okay, and then I'm doing the same for the second. Now we're going to make our strap connectors. So if you didn't move ahead like I did, I skipped ahead a little bit, you should have 8 pieces of vinyl or cork, any non-fraying material. And what you're going to start to do first is you're going to use fabric glue. So I used Fabri-Tac, and what I do is on the wrong side of one piece, I spread a thin layer of glue and I actually cover the entire piece because I want to make sure that it doesn't separate at the edges. And so it does take maybe a little bit of time, but you want to just make sure that you're applying the glue properly. Don't put too much glue, otherwise I find that it sort of ruins the top layer of cork. So you want to do a thin, even layer covering the entire piece, and then you're gluing a second piece, and they're going to be wrong sides together, so you can see the cork side on both sides. And then when you're done that, you should have these 4 pieces. Now, as I mentioned, for this, the bag in the video, I'm going to be using this shape of strap connector. So this is just a template that I'm going to use to draw out the shapes of my connectors. So I just place this over top. And I'm just going to use a regular pen. And the reason why I'm going to use just a regular pen is because when I'm cutting these out, which you're going to use a very sharp pair of scissors, this isn't something you can cut out with a rotary cutter. But when I am cutting these out, the way that I'm going to know that I'm cutting it properly is that I'm going to cut away every single bit of the ink. So I'll just do one for the video, and then I'll do the other 3 off camera. So this is what my shape looks like. Now, sometimes cork can fray at the edges, so I use an edge sealer to seal the edges of the cork connectors. Once you have your four connector shapes ready, you're going to need your fabric glue again, your four 1-inch rectangle rings, and some clips. And now what we're going to do is we're going to slip this part of the connector through one of the D-rings, one of the rectangle rings, and then we're going to fold it over. So the important part here when you're doing all four connectors is to make sure that you're folding over the same amount for each one. And you also want to make sure that you're folding them down so that this part is centered in the connector here. So I usually leave about 1/4 inch portion of the connector, like the straight edge of the connector. I leave about 1/4 of an inch, like that. And then once I've decided on how much I'm going to fold over of one of them, then I just use that one as a guide and measure for the other three. So I'm just going to add a bit of glue here, not too much. Fold that over. And then I just use some clips to hold that in place until the glue has a chance to dry. And it's also helpful if you put something heavy over top. Okay, so there's one done. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the other three. So now you're going to need one of your main body panels and your two of your strap connectors. Now you can use glue if you like, but I prefer using double-sided tape in this next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a small strip of double-sided tape on the wrong side of the connector. So this is the side where you can see the folded end. And I make sure to put the piece where it goes over this folded over tab portion and the bottom portion of the connector. So you can use glue if you don't have double-sided tape. Just make sure that you leave the glue a chance to dry before you sew on the connectors. And now when I place this, I want the top edge here of the top folded edge of the connector to be positioned just beneath those two dots that we did, the marks that we made using the main body pattern piece. I'm going to take off those clips now. Okay, and I press that and leave it in place. And then we do the same for the second one. So make sure that you're not putting any tape where you're going to be sewing. Where you're going to be sewing is just beneath here and then along the sides with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So make sure that you're not putting any tape where you're going to be sewing. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the remaining main body panel and the two remaining strap connectors. So now we're going to sew the strap connectors in place, and we are going to start by sewing at one top corner here and going across along the top here of the connector, but you know, a little distance from the rectangle ring because you don't want the foot of your machine to hit that ring. So I start here, I sew across, and then I stop and I rotate and I sew along this edge, then this edge, then this edge, and then return here to where I started. When you're rotating at the corners, it's better if you leave the needle in the down position because it will help you rotate a little bit more easily. Okay, so I'm starting here at that corner, like I mentioned just a minute ago. And one important thing to look out for when you're sewing this portion here is to make sure that you're sewing straight across and that your stitching is not crooked. Okay, so here I really want to meet that first stitch here where I started sewing. It's really important to try and meet that first stitch. Okay, I think I got it. And then I'm going to sew just the one stitch. I'm going to lift my needle, pull this away, and leave these strings here. And then I'm going to turn this around. Hopefully you can see this. So you can see my threads here sticking out. So you're going to want to find the bobbin thread that is going to pull that ending stitch. You want to pull the top stitch to the wrong side. And then you're going to knot those. I think I need my seam ripper to grab that thread. So you're looking for a loop. And I think I managed to find it. There we are. And then I actually like to tie up everything, my starting bobbin thread and the ending top thread, all of it. I like to tie all of it together at the back. So here's what it looks like. I knotted the threads and then I just put a piece of clear masking tape over top to hold the threads in place. And then that's what it looks like from the front. There's no back stitching here. Okay, so now I have all four connectors sewn on, and I do want to add rivets to these. I just think it looks nice, but if you're not comfortable with rivets, you don't have to add them if you don't want to. If you if you do want to add them, you just have to use your template. I already added some rivet placement marks to those connector templates. So I'm just going to transfer where I want to add my rivets. Okay, so now we're going to attach the two main body pieces to the bottom of our bag. Remember that the edge here with the gap where there's no foam, those are the edges you'll be attaching to the bottom edges of the main body pieces. So I'll just place this here, and then I'm lining this up here with the bottom edge. And then I'll clip them together. And then I'm going to sew these together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so once these are sewn together, you're just going to flip the bottom away from the main body, and you want that seam allowance to be pointed towards the bottom piece. Now, if you've used fabric for the bottom, you can actually press everything towards the bottom, the seam allowance and the bottom piece, so you can press that seam. But if, like me, you used cork, you can't press it, and so you're just going to finger press everything towards the bottom and top stitch the seam allowance here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from that seam. And I'm top stitching along the bottom piece. So since I can't press, I'm going to reach underneath and I'm going to make sure that I have everything pointing towards the bottom. Okay, so there it is. There's the top stitch seam allowance, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. And I am going to attach the bottom edge of this second main body panel to the opposite end of the bottom piece. So the next step is optional. It's the piping. I'm definitely going to add some piping. I found a piping that matches the darkest blue here in the fabric, so I thought that would be perfect. I know many don't like piping, and many do. So I'm going to show you how to sew this on, but I'm going to show you how to do it at the machine because I don't pin my piping. I just place it and I sew it as I go. I do find it easy in this step to use a zipper foot if you have it. If you have a really wide regular foot, this step will be difficult. So if you have a zipper foot, switch to your zipper foot on your machine. So when I stop and start my binding, I want it to be in a less obvious place. So I'm going to start and stop along this bottom edge of the bottom piece. So one of the sides that has zigzag stitching would be the best place. And so when I start, I just place the raw edge of the binding part of the piping, align it with the raw edge of the bottom piece, and I don't start sewing right at the end. So I'm going to leave about 1.5 inches free, unsewn. I'm going to use just a basting stitch and just going to start sewing that. So you want to use a seam allowance of about 1/4 inch, and also leave the needle in the down position so that when you stop and make adjustments, you don't lose the positioning of your needle. So it's fairly straightforward until you get to a curved edge. Okay, so when I get to the curved top corners, you want to clip into the seam allowance here of the binding. And that will help it lay flat and uh, curve itself smoothly. If you don't trim it, then what happens is the tape portion of the binding starts to flip up. So this way here, when you clip a few notches into the seam, into the seam allowance, into the tape portion here of the piping, it helps it to lay flat around the corner. Now, when you get to where you started sewing your piping, you want to overlap the piping the same amount that you left unsewn. So about 1.5 inches. And then I'm going to cut this. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the basting stitches from one portion of the piping. So I'm actually going to remove the basting stitches here where it meets the end here of the piping where you started. Then I'm going to open this up to reveal the cord inside. And what I want to do is cut away the cord where this piece of cord starts. So right about here. Okay. Then we're going to take this raw edge, we're going to fold it in about 1/2 inch. And then lift this, place it all nicely again. And then just pop this bit here inside, making sure that the end here where I cut the cording meets this end of the cording here. So place this raw edges meeting the raw edge of the bottom here, cording in, wrap this top portion here over top like this, and then finish basting this in place. Okay, and so that's what that should look like when you're done. So now that we have the piping attached to our bag's exterior, we can set this aside for now. And we're going to start the assembly of our gusset. So what you'll need for that is your main zipper. Okay, so I have my main closure zipper. And you're going to need your exterior zipper panels. Now, I know normally when you're attaching to the zipper, you're attaching a lining and an exterior piece to either side of the zipper. But when you're doing a drop-in lining, you're just attaching the exterior pieces to your zipper. So we will start by attaching one of the zipper panel pieces, the exterior zipper panel pieces, to one side of your zipper. And so you're going to attach this with the exterior zipper panel and the zipper right sides together. Now, normally in my patterns, you attach anything to a zipper with 1/4 inch seam allowance, but with this bag and the drop-in lining, I found that it was better to use a larger seam allowance when sewing to the zipper because the number 5 zipper has it's wider zipper, and so if you leave too much of the zipper tape showing, it zipper tape sort of behaves like bias, and so it can shift a lot. So if you take in a larger seam allowance, then it just gives more stability to the zipper itself. So now I'm going to sew these together. I'm going to start at one end, a back stitch, and then use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and go all the way to the end and back stitch again. Now, when you get to the area where you have your zipper pulls, you'll want to lift your presser foot and move the pulls out of the way, and then lower your presser foot and keep sewing. So when this is sewn, I'm going to go get my iron, and we're actually going to press the zipper panel away from the zipper, and then I'll be able to top stitch the seam allowance. Okay, so now we're going to press this away from our zipper. And then I'm going to top stitch. And I'm using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance when I top stitch. And now I'm going to repeat the same thing, and I'm going to attach the second piece, the second zipper panel, to the other side of the zipper. The important thing to look at here is to make sure that you have aligned these straight edges of your zipper panels. And you want to make sure they line up at both ends. And then I'm going to sew this in place as well. Okay, so once we have the second zipper panel sewn on, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to press it away from the zipper and then top stitch the seam allowance. Okay, so the zipper panels are now ready. We can set those aside for now. And you'll need one of your zipper and panels and one of your D-ring connectors. And we're going to start by sewing the D-ring connectors. So on the wrong side of each connector, you're going to draw a line on the wrong side. So if you're using fabric, what you're going to do is you're going to press in both halves of the D-ring connector in towards that center line, wrong sides together. So you'll want to do that and press along the entire length for both pieces. If you're using cork or vinyl like I am, then we're going to fold and sew at the same time. Okay, so here we are. We're starting at the top edge of one of the D-ring connectors, and I'm going to be folding and sewing at the same time with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from that center line. And I keep my needle in the down position because I am going to be making adjustments as I fold in towards the center. Okay, then when I get to the end, what I'll do is I'll stop and rotate, and I'll fold in this half, sew across 2 stitches, and then I continue sewing up the other side, again 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the center. So now we're going to attach the D-ring connectors to our zipper end panels. Before we start attaching those, we want to mark the centers on these two pieces. So I did include a center mark on the bottom of the pattern piece right here. So I'm going to use that to make the mark on the center here at the bottom. But along the top, you can fold the pattern piece and use the center here, or you can just measure it. Since it's 6 inches, you know that the center is going to be at 3 inches. Okay. Now we're going to need your 1-inch D-rings, and you're going to slip one of the D-ring connectors through that D-ring, and you're going to fold it onto itself 2.5 inches. And you'll see on this side, which is going to be the wrong side, you should have those raw edges at the center. So you're just going to measure 2.5 inches folded, which is this. I'm just putting clips just for now to hold this in the right position. And then I'm going to use some double-sided tape and put it down here along the center, making sure that I'm not putting any tape where I'm going to be sewing, because this is leather tape and it's very, very, very sticky. And I'm using a narrower kind. This one is 1/4 inch wide. I just find it easier to avoid sewing over it if it's a bit narrower. So I'm staying away from the top where I'm going to be sewing across, and I stay out of the seam allowance at the bottom of the D-ring connector. And I'll peel the tape backing. And then I place the center here on the bottom. And then I make sure that the top edge here is centered with that center mark here. Okay, I don't need these anymore. So I'm going to just show you sewing one of them, and then you'll have to repeat it for the second one. So now I'm going to sew this in place. I'm going to start at one of the bottom corners here, and I'm going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and sew all the way up to the top. And I'm going to stop a little distance from the D-ring. This is a very chunky D-ring, so I don't want my presser foot to have trouble getting past the bottom underneath here of the D-ring. So I think I'll probably sew across around 1/2 inch, but you're going to be able to vary that depending on how thick your hardware is. All the hardware has different thicknesses, so you'll have to figure out what is the best distance from the bottom here of the D-ring you should be sewing. So I'm going to stop, rotate, and sew across, and then stop 1/8 of an inch from this edge, and then sew all the way down, and making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. So I have my 2 D-ring connectors sewn on, and if you're comfortable with rivets, now's a good time to add some rivets. You don't need to add a rivet, only because this connector is sewn on so well that you don't have to worry about trying to make it extra strong. This is very well sewn on, and the bag isn't that big. So I'm going to add a rivet here and here. Okay, so the rivets are on. This means we can attach them to our zipper panel pieces. So what you'll want to do is first start by flipping the D-ring down. You don't want that in your seam allowance. And then you're going to line these up like this. So it should fit pretty much exactly if you use the seam allowances like I instructed. And if you're using the same size zipper as I am. And we're going to sew this together all the way across, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Now, because this is all fabric, I can actually press my seam allowance. I'm going to press it down towards the zipper end panel, and then I will go over to the machine and I'll top stitch it. I'm not going to top stitch it just yet. I'm going to attach the first one with my heavier weight thread, and then I'm going to switch to a coordinating thread to do the top stitching. Okay, so now we have our assembled gusset and we have our assembled exterior. And what we need to do before we can put these two together is to mark all of our centers. And there are quite a few of them to mark. So we're going to start by the main body pieces. So if you if you did like me when cutting your foam, you'll already have some center marks. The only thing you'll need to add in addition are your alignment marks. And I'll show you where we're going to be aligning those. So that's this mark right here on your pattern piece. You want to place that like this. And then you'll flip it over. I like to transfer the mark so it's clearly visible on the wrong side. And then you're going to transfer that mark over here. And then do the same on this side. So if you didn't cut your foam like I did, I didn't do it on this one, so I'll just add my center mark here at the top, and then my two alignment marks on either side. And then we need to mark centers along the bottom here. So the most accurate way of doing that is to fold this in half and make sure that these seams here are aligned and flatten, whoops. And then mark the center. Then do the same on this side. Okay, so mark here, 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 here. Now we're going to do marks on our zipper panel. So this one here, like I mentioned previously, there is a center mark for this piece on the pattern piece itself. So I can do this and this. And then the seam here, the stitching here where the seam is, that's actually going to be aligned with the alignment marks on the main body pieces here. And I already marked the centers on my zipper panel previously, just the way that I cut out my foam pieces. But if you don't have those already, then you'll fold this like this, and you're lining up the stitching here from these seams, flatten it, and mark your centers. And do the same on this side. Mark your centers, okay? Now, for the assembly, to attach these two together, I'm not going to clip the entire pieces together and then sew them together. It's much too difficult. Clips will go flying and you'll get very frustrated. So what we're going to do is we're going to do small sections at a time, starting at all of these center marks. So we're going to start by lining up the center mark at the bottom of one of the zipper panels, the zipper end panels, with the center mark on the bottom. So I'm lining up this spot here, and then I'm just going to add another clip over here and another one over here. And then we're going to sew a small portion from here to here, only along the straight edges. Don't sew any of the curves yet. So we're really just going to be sewing straight edges for now. The distance will vary depending on which center marks you're sewing together. So for this one, I don't want to sew any of the curved portion, so I'm going to start at this part of the straight edge and end at this part of the straight edge. I'll use my regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'll backstitch at the beginning and the end. One of the benefits of doing it as well is that I get to verify my piping to make sure that I'm sewing close enough to my piping, small sections at a time. It's much easier to do corrections and sew closer to your piping if you're only sewing small portions of the bag at a time. Okay, so here we are sewing the first section here at these center marks. Trying to feel where my piping cord is so that I'm sewing in the right spot. So I start by back stitching, and then I sew until just before the curved area, and I back stitch again. So when I'm done, I can flip it over and just have a look at my piping just to make sure that I'm happy with that. That looks really great. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite end. So I'm attaching aligning that center mark at the end of the opposite zipper end panel to the other center mark on the other side of the bottom. So I start by lining up those center marks. And then I'll just put a little clip right where I want to start sewing, and another one right where I want to stop sewing. And I'm doing exactly the same thing as I just did. little bit too far here, not paying attention, but I think I should be okay. And then again, I can turn it over and I can have a look at my piping just to make sure I'm happy. That looks great. And now I'm going to line up the center mark. This over here. So now I'm going to line up the center mark at the top of the main body panel with the center mark at the top of the zipper panel. So there's my zipper panel. So this is the center of the zipper panel. I'm clipping that to the top center mark of one of the main body lining pieces. And then I'm going to also add a clip where I want to start sewing. So basically I'm just repeating this at all of the matching center marks. And then I'm going to add a clip where I want to stop sewing. And then I'm doing exactly the same thing again. Now there is a little bit of a curve to the zipper panel, so it's a little bit trickier than the bottom part that we just did. Okay, so I have this portion sewn together now, and I'm just going to flip this over so I can have a look at my piping again. And that looks really great. So before I continue, I'm going to open my zipper all the way because we're going to need to turn the shell. So now I'm flipping over the main body, and again I'm lining up the center mark. So the center mark on the other side, other zipper panel, and the center mark at the top of the other main body panel. And I'll clip the centers, and then again I'm clipping where I want to start sewing and where I want to end my sewing. And I'm going to sew these together. Okay, again, just flipping this over, and I'm having a look at my piping. Again, that looks great. I find most of the issues with the piping is actually in the corners. Okay, so this is what it looks like now. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to line up these alignment marks with the seam of the where we attach the zipper end panels to the zipper panels. And there's not going to be much to sew above that mark, just a tiny little portion. And then there's going to be a longer portion here to sew. About right up to there. And we're going to repeat this 4 times. Okay, and I'm not going to sew much here because the curve starts pretty much right away. Okay, and then to check this one, I'm going to have to go from the inside here and turn it out a little bit. And then have a look at my piping, which again looks pretty good. I'm not usually this lucky with piping, just so you know. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to start sewing the corners. We have 8 corners to do. Let's start with the easier ones, which are the top corners because they're not as sharp. These ones are a little bit sharper. And when you're sewing a corner, you're going to need to get a pair of very sharp scissors because you're going to be cutting into your seam allowance so that you can ease around those curves. When you're sewing, we're going to stop and start and just sew the small portion of the corner at once because I always want to be sewing with the flat part of the bag on the bed of my machine. So this would be the flat part. This is the part that needs to curve around. So hopefully that makes sense. Flat part on the bed of the machine, and then the part that needs to curve and be eased in has to be at the top. So because I've already tacked this all up, there is no pinning or clipping necessary. Put your needle in the down position. Now, you'll see it kind of looks like there's not enough bag to work around this curve, but that's what you want. You want it to fit very tightly so that you don't have any puckers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually clip about 1/4 inch notches in the seam allowance of the top portion only. You're not clipping the bottom flat part, you're just clipping this top part. And that kind of helps it spread out and fit the curve better. And then at the same time, you want to maintain your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance so that your piping looks good. Okay, so I've done the one corner. Let's just flip that over and check our piping. Here's where I usually make mistakes with my piping. Okay, so this one I got lucky and it looks great. And there's also, you'll see there's no puckers here along the corner, which is what we want. So again, this is an easy corner. This is the flat part on the bed of your machine, and this is the part that has to be eased around the curve. So I'm going to get this under the foot here, needle in the down position, and again, just clipping this part here, 1/4 inch into the seam allowance, not more than that, otherwise you're going to cut some important parts. And then you'll see now it fits that curve quite nicely. Okay, and we'll flip this over and have a look, make sure that our corner looks nice. Okay, again, I got lucky, looks nice. Okay, so now I'm going to leave the 2 easier corners. I can do those later, and we're going to work on one of the more difficult corners. So this is the flat part that's going to go against the bed of your machine, and this is the portion here that's going to need to be curved around this portion here. So I'm going to start and set my needle down. Now this is definitely the trickier part. It also has piping on it, which makes it a little bit thicker and harder to work with. So when you're clipping around these corners, you're clipping through more layers because you also have your piping. Just make sure you're not clipping into the cording of your piping. Tuck it in there. And I do find with this corner, I need to stop and reposition. Usually if I'm going to make a mistake on a corner, it'll be one of these bottom corners usually. All right, so I'm going to have a look and see if I got lucky on this one. I did not. Okay, so here I sewed up my piping in the seam. So I'm just going to undo this small portion and redo it, not sewing as close to the piping as I did. Okay, so I'm going to try this again. Needle down. Let's hope I got it this time. I did. I just have to take away some of the threads here. It's still a bit kind of close, but I think it'll be fine. These are really difficult corners to sew, which is why I mentioned at the beginning that this is an advanced pattern. Okay, so there you go. So now you're going to finish and you're going to sew the 3 remaining sharper corners and then the 2 remaining easier corners at the top. And then we'll be done the exterior of our bag.
You can go ahead and trim your seam allowance, but don't trim the seam allowance on either side of your zipper panels. We're going to use the fabric in that seam allowance to tack our lining in the last video.